With you as I have been preparing ahead for the series and thinking about what fruits were to come, I have to be honest with you. I have been dreading the thought of talking about today's fruit since I started. Today, we are supposed to talk about peace. And I have to be honest with you, it has left me fresh out of creative analogies of fruit, or farms, or flowers, or food this week. It is becoming harder and harder to talk about peace, as we've mentioned, in the world that we're living in today. Every week it seems like there is some horrendous incident of violence occurring in places around the globe, like Dallas, Baton Rouge, Florida, Paris, Iraq, Syria, India, Pakistan. Recently, as a culture, we have grown so accustomed to watching members of our human community fall victim to acts of violence and alienation against one another, whether police officers, or Black or Latino communities, or women, or LGBTQ folks. And all of this recent media coverage, all of this hype about these things can sometimes obscure, but can never really erase the long history of violence that we have committed against ourselves and the created world as a community of people who are driven by success, personal accomplishment, money, and our fearful insecurities of our bodies, our inabilities to meet up to the expectations of others, and never having enough. And so as I tried to write this sermon, I struggled. Because there is no getting around the fact that we are living in anxious times, and we are very anxious people. And all of this anxiety leaves us asking questions like what we asked this morning. What do we do about it? Right now, there is an acute awareness of violence that we currently face as a society. Most of the rhetoric that the news and media and politics and even religious leaders use tends to lure us into thinking that this world is a less safe place than it has ever been, and that peace is about near impossible, both of which I believe to be factually debatable. But as you may have noticed, when our sense of security and safety is threatened as human beings, what we do is we turn our efforts and our attention toward protecting ourselves. We retreat inward. We find allies. We pinpoint enemies. And we do our best to separate ourselves from the problem as a means for self-preservation and finding a little bit of peace in this life. In the Gospel of Matthew, we encounter a similar paradigm between cultural violence and human behavior. In chapter 12, we find Jesus having two separate heated conversations with the Pharisees. One is in a grain field and one is in their synagogue. And in both of these encounters, the Pharisees are questioning Jesus as a Jewish teacher because he and his disciples don't seem to be following the Jewish law that had been handed down to these people throughout the ages, all the way from the time that Moses had penned them on 2 stone tablets. Jesus and his disciples are working on the Sabbath. They were picking grain and they were healing people, both of which any Jewish person would have known to be disobedient to the law. Now, the Pharisees often get this bad rap in evangelical Christianity for being these legalistic rule followers whose religion blinds them from caring about the people around them. And Jesus, on the other hand, is often portrayed as this humanitarian, someone who understands that religious law no longer really has any value. It doesn't matter so long as you're following Jesus and you're loving people and you're doing the right thing. But that's a little bit too simplistic of an interpretation for this text. In fact, it's not even an accurate interpretation of the New Testament. Jesus was a Jew who practiced the Jewish law all of his life. He was formed by it, and he found deep value and meaning in it. And the Sabbath was a basic requirement for any Jew. Jesus would have practiced it throughout his lifetime. And the Sabbath was not like the other little rules written about in the long litany of religious codes that you and I often skip over when we read books like Deuteronomy and Leviticus. If there was one rule that everybody knew, that all of us know, it's the Sabbath. And it's because it's the fourth commandment. When God gave Moses the commandments, he reminded Moses that keeping this Sabbath thing was important, because it was something that even God did at the very beginning of creation. The Sabbath is the culmination of all of God's work. You might have heard that human beings are the culmination of all of God's work, but I would beg to differ. Because on the seventh day, God, in his infinite wisdom and power and beauty, chose to rejoice and rest in the creation that God had made, and then invited all of creation to rest and rejoice in it with God. Keeping the Sabbath was to participate in the complete harmony that was created for, that the whole creation was created for. And we were invited to rest in it with God and with each other. And so you see, the Sabbath for a Pharisee was essential to a relationship with God. But what Jesus is upset about, what he points out in this passage, is not that the Sabbath is wrong, is not that they shouldn't follow the religious law. What Jesus is upset about is that somewhere along the lines, the Pharisees had forgotten that obeying the Sabbath, or any of the laws, wasn't just about making sure they were in right relationship with God. It was also to remind them of the types of relationships that they were created to exist in with one another. And the Pharisees had begun to use the laws in such a way that led them to forget about the people around them. See, the Pharisees were living in a world that was enduring a lot of violence. And for all intents and purposes, we can interpret the Pharisees as being good religious people who felt like they were fighting for their lives. In the last 100 years, they'd experienced multiple civil wars. Some 60 years before Jesus was even born, Rome invaded Jerusalem and took over. And in the wake of all of that violence and Roman imperialism, the Pharisees would have been reminded of every instance throughout history in which their ancestors chose to disobey God's commands, and then had to deal with the calamity that came about because of their disobedience. The Pharisees would have taken their current circumstances and would have been comparing them with their ancestors and the violence that they were experiencing. And their ancestors were driven out of their land by neighboring countries. They were thrown into slavery. They were stripped of everything they held dear. And so perhaps without even realizing it, the Pharisees had begun to follow the law, to try to uphold these ideals like the Sabbath as a means for making sure that God was on their side. They used the law as a means for ensuring self-preservation. And the problem that Jesus had with this was that in choosing to practice the law for the sake of self-preservation, they were actually alienating and ignoring the needs of the people they were created to be in relationship with, and that the law was designed to protect. For Jesus, they weren't actually obeying the law. Not in the way that the law was originally designed to work. Instead of contributing to the well-being of others, the Pharisees retreated inward. They separated themselves from the sick and the hungry and the broken. And for Jesus, that didn't actually bring about peace at all. The Pharisees weren't pursuing peace. They were pursuing personal interest. Real peace isn't about personal interest. It's not about self-preservation. It isn't about ensuring our own happiness or accomplishment or identity. And as a society that is reeling over incident after incident of hatred and violence, it would be really easy for us to think that peace is an individual endeavor about protecting our own. We are living in a culture that has become proficient at using polarizing rhetoric to draw battle and boundary lines between us and them, between Republican and Democrat, gay and straight, rich and poor, black and white, civilian and law enforcement, man and woman, religious and non-religious, American, Christian, and Muslim. We are too quick as a country and as the church to point out the enemy, in the hopes that pointing out the problem and snuffing it out will give us the security that we all crave. And as people of faith, we need to be concerned about the way we think. And when we think about the ways that the church throughout history has often used its interpretation of Scripture and its understanding of God's grace to keep us from facing one another with basic human dignity and respect. We need to be careful, and we need to be on watch when we as Christ's followers hold so rigidly to our religious laws that we turn a blind eye to those in our communities who are in desperate need of love and justice and food and safety, just because we're trying to keep the peace in our own lives. And it should be beyond troubling for every single one of us to see that the loudest and most predominant voices advocating for Christian ideals today are promoting things like intolerance, greed, hubris, and deception. And they're guising it as our American and Christian right to protect ourselves. Jesus' task was about bringing the kingdom of God into this world and restoring right relationship between us and God and us and one another. And so for Jesus, peace was never about ensuring his own personal safety. When Jesus taught his disciples the Beatitudes, Jesus didn't say, "Blessed are the peace enjoyers." He didn't say, "Blessed are the peace receivers." He said, "Peacemaker." And this, by the way, is Ren's a little bit, his contribution to A peacemaker is an action. It is an orientation toward other people, and it is something that every single one of us is called to do. And don't get me wrong, peacemaking is risky. It requires sacrifice. It demands that we put down our certainties, our polarizing rhetoric, and our blame shifting long enough to see every single person as being created by God and having inherent value. Peacemaking happens when we turn toward others and we choose to build relationships of love and tolerance that account for all of our differences, even if we disagree about them, because we are recognizing that God is God and we are not. It demands that we take an honest look at our world and truly see the people in our communities who are struggling under the weight of sin and shame. That we see the people who are forgotten about and then stand with them and speak with them and listen to them. That's exactly what Jesus did in this passage. He gave voice to those who were hungry. He stood with those who needed healing that other people didn't want to be near, that other people thought were sinful and shameful and sick. And he did all of those things even when it meant putting his own neck on the line. Peacemaking isn't about our own selfish gain. It's about communal healing. It's about restoring all of the relationships that God created. And Jesus is reminding us in this passage that we're called to be co-creators with God. We're called to help restore the life that God gave us to celebrate on the very first day of our existence, on the Sabbath. As most of you know, I work at Trenton Psychiatric Hospital on Thursday nights. And working in the hospital is always interesting, to say the least. At any given moment, life can go from dull to chaotic in just a matter of moments. Patients have good days and bad days. Staff have good days and really bad days. And you get any one of them on just the right day at just the right time, and you can have an awful lot to deal with on your hands. This past Thursday night, was no exception. We were holding our usual worship service for some of the higher functioning patients in the main chapel when a patient that I knew very well began to have a seizure. Now this patient is prone to having seizures. She has chronic seizures. I've seen them happen before, and she's all right. But this time, I was the first responder. In a matter of moments, I found myself sliding across the floor to where the patient was lying, and I had to grab her head to keep it from being thrashed onto the ground. And in the span of what probably was only 5 minutes, but felt like 20, the girl seized 4 times. As I sat with her and as I held her head and prayed, I had to admit I was incredibly scared. The other chaplains were a little surprised when I told them so because apparently I had somehow held it together. But I will tell you that inside I was freaking out. I have never been a first responder in a medical emergency before. But also, I was concerned about what this very public emergency would do to the patients around me. Incidents like this have the capacity to incite a panic even outside of the hospital. And some of these patients already have tenuous inner feelings. They have tenuous relationships with one another, and they don't need a medical emergency to push them over the edge of chairs around where the patient and I sat on the floor, sectioning us off so that we would have enough space to sit undisturbed as the patients were escorted one by one out of the chapel. And I even overheard one of the patients comment to another as they were walking past and heading toward the snack table that we always have for them at the end of each service. I heard them say that they were going to get her a cookie, the patient who had had the seizures, a cookie, so that she would have something to enjoy when she came to. I couldn't believe it. It was actually a little bit funny. Of all the times to be kind, not when I was doing a spiritual assessment with them, not when I'm walking down the halls and I have to dodge 6 patients who want Bibles that I already gave to them 2 days earlier. Why now? How could these patients exhibit such peace that even I wasn't feeling in the midst of all of this chaos? At the end of the night, I got on the bus to bring patients back to their respective units, and one of the patients said, "I sure hope she's going to be okay." And another patient who was sitting across the bus and who has a history of disliking the patient he was responding to said, "She will. They'll bring her back safe soon, don't worry." And it was in that moment that I realized the answer to my question. In the midst of all of the chaos, these patients were able to muster up the courage to be peacemakers. Because in desperate times like these, they were reminded of their common humanity. See, patients at TPH know that when something like this happens to one of them, it happens to all of them. That in really desperate times, peace isn't about doing whatever you can to keep from feeling troubled or frightened or hurt. Making peace is about offering a hand or a word of encouragement or a prayer to others who feel all of those things too, no matter what your history is with them. In these troubled times, what happens to one of us happens to all of us. When we alienate and ostracize and ignore one another for the sake of our own preservation, we do harm, not peace. Jesus calls us to be peacemakers, church. Peace doers. So let's do it.